Today, the World Cup begins in Mexico City at a stadium that has hosted this competition 3 times across 6 decades of history. 83,000 people are gathering for a match between Mexico and South Africa that will open the most expansive tournament football has ever staged. The football is here. It arrived with all its capacity for beauty and drama and the particular kind of joy that only this competition produces. And it arrived carrying more institutional baggage, more formal complaints, more documented grievances from more directions simultaneously than any World Cup in living memory. Because the nations and institutions that have turned against FIFA over the concerns surrounding this tournament did not do so quietly. They did not raise their objections in private correspondence that was filed and forgotten. They raised them in formal legal complaints, in walkouts from governing body meetings, in public statements from federation presidents and fan organization directors, in accusations of vindictive behavior directed at the primary host. In formal documentation filed with competition authorities in the language of coaches and players and supporters groups that has been pointed, specific, and impossible to dismiss as background noise. The governing body's mantra for this tournament is simple and familiar. Football unites the world. It is the promotional headline, the campaign theme, the 4 words that appear on the signage and the promotional material and the official communications of a tournament that, as it opens today, has generated the most concentrated wave of formal institutional opposition in the competition's modern history. So what's really happening here? Let's go through it carefully, starting with the freshest and most specific developments and building outward to the full picture. Breel Embleau plays for Switzerland. He was born in Cameroon. He holds Swiss citizenship. He is a professional footballer at a major European club. Selected for his national team's World Cup squad after years of international football. 10 days before the tournament opened, his ESTA travel authorization, the electronic system used by nationals of visa waiver countries to travel to the United States, was flagged as under review, not denied, under review in a state of administrative uncertainty that meant he could not confirm his ability to travel to the competition he had been selected for. The case drew immediate international attention and raised what one assessment described as uncomfortable questions about how many others might face similar obstacles. Embleau's situation was eventually resolved. He is at the tournament. But the fact that a Swiss international player, a citizen of one of Europe's most stable democracies, traveling on a valid passport under a visa waiver program, found his travel authorization under review 10 days before the World Cup is a measure of the uncertainty that has surrounded this tournament for players as well as supporters. The Iranian Federation situation went considerably further. 14 backroom staff and officials, including the Federation's Secretary General and Vice President, were denied visas to enter the United States ahead of games in Los Angeles and Seattle. The Federation did not use careful language in describing what had happened. It accused the United States of vindictive behavior. Those are not the words of a federation making a diplomatic complaint. They are the words of an institution that has concluded it is deliberately being targeted. The people denied were not players. They were the administrative and technical infrastructure that a national team requires to function at a World Cup. The people who handle logistics, medical operations, technical analysis, and the dozens of operational responsibilities that a major tournament participation requires. Having 14 of them denied access to the venues where their team is playing is not an inconvenience. It is a direct challenge to the ability of a qualified nation to compete on equal terms. FIFA's official position on all of these situations has remained consistent throughout. The governing body is not involved in host country immigration processes. A host government ultimately determines who receives a visa and who is admitted into their country. That position is technically accurate. FIFA does not control the visa process of a sovereign nation. But the criticism that has surrounded that position, voiced by fan organizations, federation officials, legal experts, and the former FIFA president himself, is equally specific. The governing body had years to negotiate binding guarantees that would protect the ability of all participants to attend the tournament without restriction. It did not secure those guarantees. It accepted the hosting arrangement without them. And when the consequences of that acceptance arrived, a Somali referee denied entry after 11 hours of questioning. 14. Iranian officials without visas, a Swiss player's travel authorization flagged under review. The governing body's response was to note that these decisions were made by someone else. That response has drawn what one analysis described simply as scorn from those who believe the governing body had both the time and the leverage to do better. And the scorn has been formal as well as public. Football Supporters Europe and Euro Consumers, two of the most established consumer and supporter advocacy organizations in European football, filed an official complaint against FIFA over the tournament's ticket pricing. Their allegation was precise and significant. FIFA, they said, holds a monopoly over ticket sales for the World Cup and used that power to impose conditions on fans that would never be acceptable in a competitive market. The phrase monopoly abuse is not incidental language. It is a specific legal concept with specific legal consequences, and it was deployed deliberately by organizations with the institutional knowledge to understand exactly what they were claiming. Their complaint detailed the mechanism of the abuse as they saw it. Dynamic pricing introduced for the first time at a World Cup, raising costs by an average of 35% across 95 of the 104 matches. A limited batch of discounted tickets around £45 each announced in December in response to the initial public outcry, which the organization said were mostly gone before general sales even began. Bait advertising, they called it, the practice of advertising a price point that is not meaningfully available to the supporter who sees it. FIFA, as a not-for-profit organization generating $3 billion from ticketing alone, 27% of total revenue, compared to the historical 10 to 15% that ticketing has represented at previous editions. The Football Supporters Association, the representative body for supporters in England, described the ticket prices as a laughable insult to fans, not a concern, not a disappointment, a laughable insult. That is language chosen with precision. It reflects a level of institutional anger that goes beyond individual unhappiness about cost. It reflects the feeling shared widely across the supporter community in multiple countries that the governing body has treated the people who attend its matches as a revenue extraction opportunity rather than as the foundation of the competition's legitimacy. Here's the interesting part. Because the formal complaints about ticketing exist alongside formal documentation of what those prices have done to the attendance picture. Around 80% of hotel operators across the 11 American host cities reported bookings tracking below their initial forecasts. Aviation data confirmed that advanced bookings from Europe fell significantly year on year. More than 17,000 supporters who had already purchased tickets can-led them. 350,000 tickets for matches in Dallas were still unsold when the City Council received its briefing. An England warm-up match in Tampa drew 13,000 people to a 69,000-seat stadium. These are not projections or estimates. They are documented, measurable consequences of a pricing and access strategy that formal institutions have now placed in legal complaint processes in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. The Attorneys General of New York and New Jersey have issued subpoenas. The Attorney General of California has written formally. Football Supporters Europe and Euro Consumers have filed with competition authorities. These are not the same complaint made by different people. They are different complaints about different specific practices filed through different legal frameworks by different institutions, all pointing at the same governing body. Now, this is where things change because the institutional opposition to FIFA's management of this tournament is not limited to ticketing. The heads of 20 European football federations discussed boycott possibilities earlier this year. And while none ultimately followed through, the fact that 20 federation presidents were in a room considering whether to withdraw their nation's teams from a World Cup is a measure of institutional confidence in the governing body that cannot simply be reset by a promotional campaign. La Liga filed its own complaint against FIFA, not about this specific tournament, but about the pattern of decision-making that produced it. The Spanish League's statement accused FIFA of showing complete disregard for the football community with its unilateral decisions about the World Cup format and the club World Cup calendar. It said FIFA continues its malpractice of making unilateral decisions on the world football calendar. That phrase, continues its malpractice, frames the 2026 situation not as an isolated failure but as part of a pattern. The players' unions had reached the same conclusion independently. Representatives of the Global Players Union and the Professional Footballers Association criticized the expanded format, specifically raising concerns about player welfare in a competition that now requires teams to play 8 matches over 39 days following a club season that had already demanded 60 or more matches from the sport's elite players. The expanded tournament that was marketed to the world as a celebration of football's inclusivity was described by those representing the players within it as a further imposition on athletes already at the limits of what a professional body can sustain. Think about what it means for this to be the context in which the World Cup opens today. Not a single complaint from a single direction, a formal legal challenge from supporter organizations in Europe, a formal investigation from 3 American state attorneys general, 14 Iranian officials denied visas, and an accusation of vindictive behavior. Somali referees sent home after 11 hours of questioning. A Swiss international player with his travel authorization under review 10 days before the tournament. 20 European federation heads discussing boycotts, La Liga accusing FIFA of malpractice, the Global Players Union raising welfare concerns about the format, and an Amnesty International report describing a human rights emergency in the primary host country, a report that was published before the first ball was kicked. The bigger issue is what all of this taken together reveals about the relationship between the governing body and the constituencies that the World Cup is supposed to serve. Because FIFA's response to each strand of this opposition has followed a consistent pattern. Formal statements of commitment, references to reinvestment of revenue in the development of the game, the not-for-profit designation cited as evidence of institutional virtue, and where specific questions were asked about specific decisions, a consistent withdrawal to the position that host governments are sovereign, that the governing body cannot be held responsible for the decisions of others, and that the processes in place are appropriate for a competition of this scale. That response is not without any merit. FIFA does operate within legal and political frameworks it cannot fully control. Host governments are sovereign. The not-for-profit designation is real, and the revenue generated does flow to the development of football in smaller nations through a distribution mechanism that has real effects. These things are true, but they do not answer the specific complaints filed by Football Supporters Europe about monopoly abuse. They do not address the specific allegations in the Attorneys General subpoenas about seat map changes and dynamic pricing practices. They do not explain why the governing body had years to negotiate visa guarantees for all participants and did not secure them. They do not account for the 14 Iranian officials sitting enthroned without the papers they needed to support their team. And they do not resolve the question that sits at the center of all of this: whether the governing body's stated commitment to football's universality is reflected in the operational decisions it makes, or whether it exists primarily in the promotional material. What do you think? You followed football long enough to understand the difference between an institution that makes mistakes in a genuine attempt to serve the game and one that has decided the game primarily serves the institution. The formal complaints, the walkouts, the boycott discussions, the legal subpoenas, the accusations of vindictive behavior. Do they collectively feel like the product of reasonable institutional failures in an extraordinarily complex tournament? Or do they feel like the documented consequence of a governing body that made deliberate choices about what it valued most? The football answers nothing directly. It never does, but it begins today. And somewhere inside the noise of all of this institutional turbulence in the Aztec tonight, in the first match of the first day of the biggest tournament in the competition's history, the game itself is about to provide the only answer it ever gives to the questions surrounding it. Not a verdict, not a resolution, just football in all its capacity to make everything else for 90 minutes at a time seem briefly and completely beside the right.